Welcome, the anointed ones. The most fragile thing in the world isn't a person under pressure. It's a system that depends on people never realizing they can walk away. That single truth is why some powerful people are pacing right now, checking numbers that don't make sense, watching structures they thought were permanent start to leak from places they never reinforced. Not because there was a riot, not because someone exposed secret files on a screen, but because something far more inconvenient happened. People left with their minds intact. Here's a fact most operations never plan for. When even one pattern of control is exposed, participation drops fast. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, efficiently, and in large numbers. History shows it again and again. Systems don't collapse from rebellion first, they collapse from withdrawal, from people choosing not to feed the machine anymore. And once that happens, panic spreads faster than obedience ever did. What they never expected was you. Not as a hero, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as an interruption. You weren't supposed to make it out clear-headed. You weren't supposed to function, speak normally, or move forward without dragging visible damage behind you. That was the plan, that was the script, and you skipped the ending. Now imagine running an operation that depends on exhaustion, confusion, and fear, only to realize that millions are suddenly rethinking their loyalty, their labor, their silence, and their patience. That's not a PR problem. That's an internal emergency. That's executives pretending everything is fine while aggressively not sleeping. And here's the part that adds insult to injury. You didn't even try to shut anything down. No megaphone, no manifesto, no dramatic exit speech. You just lived normally afterward, which, inconveniently for them, turned out to be louder than any protest. Yes, that irony hurts, deeply. This isn't a story about chaos. It's a story about what happens when a system realizes it was never as solid as it advertised. When escape stops being a rumor and becomes a visible option. When the door they swore didn't exist is suddenly crowded. So if certain people seem unusually angry, unusually defensive, and unusually invested in discrediting someone who doesn't matter, relax. That's not rage, that's accounting, and the numbers are not in their favor. Number 1. You were never meant to win quietly. Your escape exposed the entire system. They never planned for you to leave whole. That's the part people miss. The system wasn't built to stop escape completely. It was built to make sure anyone who got out was too damaged to matter. Tired people don't talk clearly. Confused people doubt themselves. Broken people are easy to dismiss. You were supposed to carry the scars so publicly that no one would want to follow. Instead, you walked away, clear-headed, functional, and still yourself. That single outcome broke the math of the entire operation. Once you escaped without collapsing, the story they sold stopped working. They relied on the idea that survival required obedience and that freedom came with a permanent cost. You proved otherwise just by existing normally afterward. No speeches, no announcements, no need to convince anyone. People noticed on their own. They saw that the promised consequences didn't show up, and when fear loses credibility, it loses power. Your escape didn't cause noise, it caused recalculation. People started quietly reviewing their own situations, not emotionally, not dramatically, but practically. They began to notice how much they were giving and how little they were receiving. They saw that staying was a choice, not a sentence. That shift doesn't happen all at once, but when it starts, it doesn't stop. One person stepping out cleanly makes everyone else wonder why they're still standing in line. That's why they're angry, not because you attacked them, but because you made their control visible. Systems like that depend on being invisible. The moment people can see the structure, they can step around it. You didn't tear the building down. You turn the lights on, and once the lights are on, exits become obvious. They couldn't punish you without proving your point, They couldn't ignore you without letting others follow. Every response made things worse. You became the proof they never prepared for. Someone who left and didn't fall apart. That kind of proof spreads quietly and costs them everything over time. You didn't just escape. You changed what escape looks like. And once that happens, the system is already finished. Number 2, you accidentally became proof, and proof is more dangerous than protest. You didn't set out to expose anything. That's the part that makes this so uncomfortable for them. You weren't trying to lead a movement, rally people, or take anything down. You simply survived honestly and kept going. And in doing that, you became proof. Not the loud kind that waves signs or demands attention, but the quiet kind that sits in the room and changes the temperature without saying a word. Protest can be managed. It can be argued with, mocked, divided, or drowned out. Proof can't. Proof doesn't need permission or agreement. It just exists. The moment people see proof, their mind starts working on its own. They don't need convincing because the evidence is right in front of them. You didn't tell anyone the system was lying. Your life after it did. What made you dangerous wasn't your opinion, but your outcome. You were expected to fail, fade, or spiral. That was the unspoken rule. When you didn't, it raised questions that no authority figure could answer cleanly. If you're okay, then the fear was exaggerated. If you're stable, then the threats weren't absolute. If you're still standing, then the rules weren't real in the first place. People don't change their behavior because someone tells them to. They change when they see a contradiction they can't ignore. You became that contradiction. The more normal you looked, the more unsettling it was. You weren't angry enough to dismiss. You weren't broken enough to pity. You were just fine. And that's devastating to a system that depends on extremes. Proof spreads quietly. One person notices, then another. No announcement, no meeting, no grand moment. Just small internal shifts happening everywhere at once. People start withholding effort, loyalty, belief. They stop defending what no longer makes sense. That kind of withdrawal doesn't show up as chaos. It shows up as loss of control. They can label protest as trouble. They can call it emotional or irrational. Proof doesn't fit into those boxes. They can't argue with it without looking dishonest. They can't erase it without drawing attention to it. And every attempt to explain you away only highlights the fact that you exist. You didn't shout. You didn't attack. You didn't even try. You just became proof. And that's why they're still trying to recover from you. Number 3, their power relied on secrecy, and you made secrecy impossible. Their strength was never as solid as it looked. It depended on people not comparing notes, not trusting their instincts, and not realizing that the same pressure was being applied to everyone. Secrecy kept each person thinking their experience was isolated, personal, or somehow deserved. As long as people believed that, the system stayed safe. The moment that belief cracked, everything else followed. You didn't expose hidden documents or reveal confidential plans. What you did was more disruptive. You made patterns visible. When you walked away and stayed clear, people began to notice similarities between their own experiences and yours. The confusion they carried suddenly had a shape. What felt random started to look deliberate. And once something has a pattern, it can be named. Once it's named, it can't hide. Secrecy survives on silence, mixed with shame. It needs people to think they're alone in what they're feeling, or that speaking up would only make things worse. Your presence after the system broke you was a quiet signal that survival didn't require silence anymore. You didn't have to say it. People saw it in how you moved, how you spoke, how you didn't carry the fear they were warned would follow escape. When secrecy disappears, fear loses coordination. Individuals stop acting on instructions and start acting on understanding. They realized the threats were recycled, the consequences exaggerated, and the control methods predictable. That realization doesn't cause rebellion. It causes independence. People begin to make decisions without asking permission, and that's when authority starts to slip. They tried to keep everything compartmentalized so no one could see the whole picture. You unintentionally pulled those compartments together, not by force, but by example. You became a reference point people could quietly compare themselves to. That comparison did the damage. Once secrecy breaks, there's no clean way to restore it. You can't make people unsee patterns. You can't put the questions back where they were. Every attempt to tighten control only confirms that something was being hidden in the first place. You didn't tear anything down directly. You removed the curtain. And without that curtain, their power stopped functioning the way it used to. That's why they're unsettled. Their control depended on darkness. You let the light in without even trying. Number 4. They needed you to become a warning, but you became a map instead. They spent years shaping you into a cautionary tale, a living example of what happens when someone resists. Every rule, every manipulation, every fear-inducing story was designed so that your survival would look impossible to anyone who watched. You were supposed to fail spectacularly, to collapse under pressure, to become a symbol that reinforced their control. That was the plan. That was the script. And then you walked away, and nothing went according to their design. By simply existing after the ordeal, you became something far more dangerous than a warning, a map. People started noticing the signs you left behind without even realizing it. How you stayed composed, how you navigated the threats, how you maintained your mind and your dignity, all of it became reference points for others who had been trapped in the same system. You weren't showing people how to fight. You were showing them how to survive step by step, and that subtle shift in perspective is far more powerful than a loud rebellion. A warning tells people what not to do. A map shows them the path forward, and once someone sees the path, the fear that once kept them frozen loses its grip. Your example quietly taught others that they could do what was once unimaginable, move forward without being destroyed. Every system built on control fears this more than anything because it's invisible until it's too late. People start acting on their own. They stop waiting for instructions. They start recalculating. They tried to anticipate your next move, tried to predict how your escape would influence others, but the truth is, your existence was already contagious. People didn't need your permission to follow the map you created. They simply recognized the way out. That recognition spread faster than any punishment they could impose, faster than any narrative they could construct to discredit you. By surviving and remaining intact, you shattered their narrative. You didn't just resist. You gave direction. You weren't the warning they wanted you to be. You were the blueprint they never imagined someone could leave behind. And that's why they are still scrambling, trying to cover tracks that are already illuminated by your very presence. Number 5. Their anger isn't personal. It's financial, strategic, and existential. Their fury isn't about you as a person. It's about the fact that you disrupted a system built to predict behavior, extract loyalty, and generate influence. They didn't invest resources just to control lives. They invested resources to maintain an economy of obedience. Every plan, every pipeline, every network relied on people following scripts without question. You didn't just step off the script, you shattered it in a way that left gaps too large to ignore. That's why their anger isn't personal, it's financial. Every disengaged mind, every quietly exited individual represents lost value, lost time, and lost leverage. But it's more than numbers. It's strategic. Their operations were designed to minimize surprises. Every decision depended on assumptions that people would react in predictable ways. You broke those assumptions. They counted on fear, fatigue, and confusion to enforce compliance, and you refused to play along. By doing what was natural and rational for you, leaving with clarity and composure, you invalidated months, maybe years, of calculated strategy. Their spreadsheets and timelines, their meetings and contingency plans suddenly no longer matched reality. That is a strategic failure, and it drives them mad in ways personal insults never could. And at the core of it, it's existential. Systems like these survive on the illusion of inevitability. They need people to believe that resistance is impossible, that outcomes are predetermined, that escape comes at a cost too high to risk. You didn't just resist. You survived cleanly, intact, and clear-minded. That simple fact calls into question their entire narrative, and once doubt creeps in, the foundations start to crumble. They are furious because your existence proves what they can never admit. Their power was conditional, fragile, and entirely dependent on compliance. Your actions didn't create chaos by design. They created a reckoning simply by living beyond expectation. And every reaction, every overcompensation, every frantic attempt to reassert control is just proof that they know the world is no longer theirs to command. You didn't start a fight. You rewrote the rules, and that kind of disruption is impossible to ignore, uncount, or erase. Number 6, you triggered an unplanned chain reaction. They couldn't contain. They built their operations assuming every move could be monitored, every outcome predicted, and every failure contained. That illusion of control was central to their entire system. Then you happened, not as a leader, not as a rebel, not as someone trying to dismantle anything intentionally, but simply as someone who survived, moved forward, and didn't collapse under the pressure they designed to break you. That's all it took to start a chain reaction they never planned for, a series of events that spread quietly but unstoppable. The first domino was you. Your calm, intact presence after leaving their grip created ripples. People who were still inside the system noticed patterns they had ignored for years. They compared experiences, whispered to one another, and began to connect dots. The pressure that was once invisible suddenly had outlines. No one needed to point fingers. The inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. That kind of influence isn't loud or flashy. It's precise, untraceable, and deadly for anyone relying on secrecy. What made the chain reaction unstoppable is that it was unplanned. Systems can often recover from sabotage or protest because they can anticipate it. They can threaten, manipulate, and redirect. But they cannot recover from awareness spreading organically. Awareness doesn't obey their rules. Awareness doesn't stop when they issue warnings or manipulate narratives. Each person who notices the pattern, who steps back, who reconsiders their participation, becomes a new domino in a sequence that accelerates without supervision. You didn't instruct anyone to act. You didn't provide a plan. You didn't even speak about what you went through. You existed in a way that revealed the cracks. That revelation is more contagious than orders because it is undeniable. People inside the system started questioning everything on their own, and once questioning begins, obedience falters, and the illusion of control collapses faster than any direct attack could. They are scrambling because the chain reaction is still unfolding. Every attempt to reassert control only proves how fragile their foundation was. You didn't break the system by force. You broke it by living beyond their expectations, creating consequences they never calculated, and setting a chain reaction into motion that they can no longer stop. Number 7, they didn't lose control all at once. They lost it through you. Control isn't lost in a single dramatic moment. It seeps away quietly, one unnoticed failure at a time, and that's exactly what happened through you. You weren't loud. You weren't confrontational. You simply acted as if their rules didn't apply. And that tiny act, repeated in the way you carried yourself, chipped away at their grip far more effectively than any protest or public rebellion could. Systems like theirs rely on predictability, on people responding in ways that reinforce authority. You broke that pattern, and with it, their certainty. Every choice you made that defied their expectations became a small earthquake inside their structure. You didn't just remove yourself from their influence, you removed their ability to predict what would happen next. Every time someone saw you functioning normally, confident and unaffected, it was a reminder that their control was never absolute. That realization is devastating because it cannot be bargained with. You can argue against compliance, but you cannot argue against someone who has already survived without it. They built an entire network expecting people to fall apart quietly, to accept limitations, and to maintain fear-driven obedience. You didn't. That single deviation forces recalculation everywhere. When others notice your survival and stability, they begin to question the rules themselves. Obedience, once assumed, begins to unravel. What they thought was a system controlled by hierarchy and manipulation starts collapsing under the weight of independent thought and action. Control that is lost through example is irreversible. You didn't just leave, you demonstrated that departure was possible without destruction. That knowledge spreads faster and more widely than any directive or warning they issue. Each person who internalizes that example reduces their influence. Each observation of your stability undercuts their authority. By the time they realized the scale of what was happening, it was too late. You didn't break their operation with one strike. You eroded it steadily, invisibly, through the undeniable proof of your existence. They are furious because control isn't just lost through chaos. It's lost quietly, one intact survivor at a time, and you became the first domino. Number 8. You exposed how fragile their power really was. Their power always looked solid from the outside. They projected confidence, precision, and inevitability, and most people believed it because that was the image carefully constructed for consumption. What nobody counted on was someone like you surviving and observing without being absorbed into the machinery. The moment you moved beyond their influence, quietly and clearly, the facade began to crack. You didn't destroy anything directly. You didn't announce yourself as a threat. You simply exposed the fact that the empire they built wasn't as unshakable as they claimed. Power that relies on fear and manipulation is inherently fragile. It functions as long as the illusion holds. You demonstrated that the illusion was just that, an illusion. People saw that the rules they were told were immutable could be navigated, bent, or bypassed. People saw that the consequences they feared weren't absolute, and seeing that erodes the credibility of the entire system. Once credibility falters, compliance begins to evaporate. What makes this even more devastating for them is that it didn't require chaos. No riots, no sabotage, no loud defiance. Your calm, clear-headed presence, your continued functioning in the world, served as a quiet indictment of everything they relied on. Every time someone noticed your stability, your integrity, or the normalcy of your life, it highlighted the gaps in their control. Every observed contradiction forced their followers to reconsider what they had been led to believe. Fragility spreads faster than strength when exposed. Once one person witnesses that the supposed unbreakable system can be disrupted, or in this case, quietly bypassed, they tell another. That quiet awareness becomes contagious. That's why operations like theirs panic when even a single person slips free. Because it isn't just one loss. It's the first hint that the entire structure might crumble under scrutiny. By living, surviving, and remaining intact, you became proof that their power was conditional, fragile, and heavily dependent on obedience. You didn't just escape them, you revealed them. And that revelation is more destabilizing than any attack could ever be. They aren't just angry. They're scrambling to pretend solidity where none exists. And every second you exist proves their control was never real. Number 9. They're furious because you cost them time, not just influence. Influence can be rebuilt. Narratives can be rewritten. Money can be redirected. Time, however, is the one resource they cannot recover, and you made them lose an enormous amount of it. That's the real source of their anger. You didn't just reduce their reach. You forced them to go backward. Years of planning, conditioning, and slow behavioral shaping unraveled because you disrupted the timeline they were counting on. Their operation depended on momentum. Small controls layered over long periods, habits formed quietly, dependence deepened gradually. It was never meant to be rushed. You interrupted that flow. When you left intact and others followed mentally, they didn't just lose people. They lost the future outcomes they had already budgeted for. The loyalty they expected next year. The obedience they assumed 5 years from now. The long-term returns that justified everything they invested early on. Now they're stuck revisiting steps they thought were complete. Reworking messaging that already ran its course. Repeating pressure tactics that no longer land the same way. Trying to reinforce beliefs that should have been locked in by now. That kind of regression is exhausting and humiliating for a system that prides itself on being ahead. You force them into reactive mode, and reaction always burns more time than control ever did. What really hurts them is that they can't speed things up to compensate. Awareness doesn't rush. Trust doesn't reset instantly. Once people disengage mentally, you can't fast-track them back into compliance. Every attempt to regain control now takes longer, costs more, and produces weaker results. You didn't just slow the machine. You introduced friction it was never designed to handle. And here's the part they hate admitting. Even if they stabilize things temporarily, the lost time compounds. Opportunities they missed don't come back. Windows they let close stay closed. People who would have been easy to manage years ago are now older, wiser, and far less willing to play along. That shift changes everything long-term. You didn't steal attention. You stole years. You forced recalculations they never scheduled for. And that kind of damage doesn't show up immediately. It shows up later when they realize they're working twice as hard for half the result. That's why they're furious. You didn't just interrupt their operation. You aged it. Number 10. You didn't incite rebellion. You removed the spell. Their entire operation relied on enchantments disguised as rules, rituals, and fear tactics. People weren't just obeying instructions. They were under the impression that compliance was the only way to survive, that resistance came at a cost too high to bear. You didn't rebel. You didn't lead anyone into defiance or create chaos. What you did was far more dangerous. You quietly removed the illusion that kept people trapped. You lived beyond their expectations, unbroken and unmanipulated, and in doing so, you shattered the spell that held millions in place. When the spell is broken, people don't rise up loudly. They start thinking differently. They stop checking for approval. They stop fearing the consequences, and they start making decisions for themselves. The system they built depended on invisible chains, but chains only work if people don't notice they exist. You made people notice. You didn't need to shout or demonstrate. Your freedom and stability spoke volumes. Every interaction, every subtle demonstration of normalcy became a signal. It's possible to exist without their control. That realization spreads faster than any organized resistance. A system can survive protests, riots, or complaints. It cannot survive the slow, invisible withdrawal of belief and obedience. Once people see that their supposed restrictions are optional, the rules no longer carry authority. You didn't incite people to act. You made acting inevitable because the fear that held them captive no longer functioned. What terrifies them most is that this isn't something they can undo. No punishment, no narrative spin, no backdoor manipulation can restore the spell once awareness spreads. People begin walking the edges of the structure, quietly refusing to participate, quietly reclaiming power. That quiet reclamation is unstoppable because it isn't guided, it's self-initiated. You didn't create rebellion. You dissolved control. You didn't fight them in the way they expected. You simply existed beyond their reach, and that existence became contagious. The spell they relied on is gone, and nothing they do now can put it back. Your freedom didn't just disrupt them, it erased the rules they thought were permanent. And that is why they are scrambling, furious, and completely unprepared. Number 11. Their smear campaigns failed because the truth already moved ahead of them. They always assumed that if they could control the narrative, they could control everything. Every lie, exaggeration, and manipulation was carefully timed to stay ahead of the truth. They thought they could discredit you, cast doubt on your story, and keep the world believing their version of reality. What they didn't anticipate was that the truth doesn't wait for permission. And in your case, it moved faster than anything they could fabricate. By the time they tried to smear you, people had already seen what they couldn't hide. Your survival, clarity, and integrity became evidence that contradicted every story they tried to push. Their attacks, instead of silencing you, highlighted the difference between their narrative and reality. Every attempt to twist facts or manipulate perception only confirmed what everyone had already suspected, that their version was built on control, fear, and deception, and your life exposed it. The dangerous part for them isn't just that the lies failed, it's that the truth became self-propelling. You didn't need to explain or defend yourself. People noticed patterns, drew conclusions, and quietly shared what they realized with others. Their attempts to discredit you actually accelerated awareness. Every overreaction, every defensive statement, every smear report became a red flag that signaled the system's fragility. They counted on fear to protect the story. They counted on confusion to slow the spread of knowledge. But your consistency made that impossible. Truth travels naturally because it doesn't require coercion, timing, or theatrical exaggeration. By existing authentically, you made their manipulations irrelevant. The system's power relied on controlling perceptions, but when reality moves faster than propaganda, influence collapses. They're furious because nothing they do can go back in time. No amount of rhetoric, discrediting, or hidden pressure can unsee the proof of what you've survived, the clarity you've maintained, and the life you've rebuilt. Every smear they launch now is a monument to their desperation. You didn't just survive, you made the truth unavoidable, undeniable, and unstoppable, leaving them powerless to shape the story any longer. Number 12. You escaped with something. They couldn't take back discernment. They can control your body, monitor your actions, and manipulate your environment. But there is one thing they cannot touch once it's fully awakened: discernment. That's what you carried with you when you left. They were counting on fear, confusion, and isolation to cloud your judgment, to make you follow patterns that kept you trapped. They assumed that even if you survived, you would still be vulnerable to influence. They underestimated the power of clear perception, and that underestimation is why they are furious now. Discernment is dangerous for them because it breaks the illusion of inevitability. It allows you to see where manipulation begins and ends, where threats are exaggerated, and where control is conditional rather than absolute. Once you recognize the mechanics behind their operations, you stop reacting automatically. You stop being a pawn, Every decision becomes intentional, calculated, and self-directed. That clarity is not just personal, it spreads silently. People around you start noticing patterns they were told not to see, and suddenly their obedience is no longer guaranteed. They tried to make you dependent on them, to erode your confidence in your own judgment, but discernment cannot be erased. No smear campaign, no threat, no pressure can remove the knowledge you gained from seeing the system for what it really was. It's a permanent shift in awareness. They can punish bodies, but they cannot punish understanding. That's why they panic when they realize you left whole, not broken, not confused, not fearful, but fully awake. What makes discernment even more devastating is that it's contagious. One person thinking clearly can inspire others to re-evaluate their choices. Control that once seemed absolute begins to crumble from the inside. The system depends on compliance, ignorance, and unquestioning behavior. You removed all three without trying. You didn't just escape physically, you escaped mentally, emotionally, and strategically. They are furious not because you defied them outwardly, but because you saw through them and will never look back. That is a loss they cannot reclaim, a power they cannot regain, and a truth that will continue to unravel their operation long after they try to convince themselves otherwise. You walked away with your mind intact, and that is a victory they can never take away. Number 13. Millions didn't follow you. They followed themselves out. The reality they can't admit is that your actions weren't the spark of rebellion. They were the confirmation of something people already knew deep down. Millions weren't running after you. They were finally running toward their own clarity. They were tired of the invisible rules, the manipulation, the constant calculations that drained their energy and autonomy. You didn't lead them. They followed the map your survival created, realizing they had permission to think, decide, and act for themselves. That alone shattered a system designed to make obedience habitual. When someone like you walks away intact, calm, and functional, it creates a ripple effect that can't be controlled. Others start noticing the patterns they'd ignored for years. They compare notes, even silently, and suddenly the puzzle pieces fit together. They see the inconsistencies, the pressure points, the unspoken rules, and they realize that they've been operating under a shadow they no longer need to obey. That recognition doesn't require speeches, meetings, or declarations. Awareness alone moves people toward action, and once it spreads, the system can't recover. The reason this is devastating is because it's invisible until it's too late. Unlike a protest or an open challenge, the withdrawal of loyalty, participation, and belief is quiet. It looks like nothing on the surface, but underneath, everything is shifting. Every person who chooses themselves over the imposed structure removes power from the center and redistributes it internally. It's a silent revolution, one that can't be blamed on a single leader, because it originates from personal choice, not orchestration. They're furious because they realize the scale of what happened can't be pinned on you. They can't intimidate millions into returning to a system they've already seen through. Every effort to reassert authority now only highlights the independence they can no longer contain. You didn't just survive, you became proof that obedience was optional. Millions didn't follow you. They remembered that they always had the power to follow themselves, and that realization is a wound that no control, threat, or manipulation can ever fully heal. Number 14. They're furious because you proved they were never inevitable. Their power always depended on the story that they were untouchable, unavoidable, and permanent. They wanted everyone to believe that resistance was futile, that failure was guaranteed, and that the system would always win. That illusion was the backbone of their control. Then you happened. You survived. You moved forward. you remained intact. And in doing so, you proved the single truth they feared most. Nothing about their operation was inevitable. Every rule they imposed, every fear they instilled, every expectation of compliance was conditional, fragile, and breakable. Your existence after their schemes collapsed the myth they built around themselves. People who were still inside saw that escape wasn't a legend, that survival wasn't an accident, and that obedience wasn't compulsory. By simply continuing, you demonstrated that the paths they claimed were mandatory could be avoided. That demonstration doesn't require speeches, protests, or overt defiance. It exists quietly, but the implications are explosive. Once the notion of inevitability is gone, fear loses its teeth. People begin recalculating, rethinking, and quietly reclaiming agency they thought was gone forever. What terrifies them most is that proving inevitability wrong isn't reversible. You can't take back the realization that systems built on intimidation and manipulation are optional. Once someone sees it, it spreads. Others start observing, questioning, and comparing. Control that was thought absolute begins to crumble because people recognize they were never trapped in the first place. They were just convinced to stay. That shift in awareness is catastrophic for them because it operates independently of their narrative. They're furious because nothing they do can reinstate the illusion. No amount of coercion, threats, or propaganda can undo the proof you created simply by surviving, thriving, and existing free from their designs. Every attempt to regain authority highlights the very fragility they are trying to hide. You didn't just escape. You disproved a core assumption of their power. You proved they were never inevitable, and that single revelation undermines everything they thought untouchable, leaving them scrambling, furious, and powerless in a way that no traditional attack could ever achieve. Conclusion. What you've just seen isn't a story about luck, chance, or random survival. It's a blueprint for how a single person, operating beyond expectation, clarity intact and free from manipulation, can shatter systems that seemed untouchable, expose truths that were meant to stay hidden, and spark awakenings that ripple through millions. Every point we've discussed paints the same reality. You didn't just leave. You disrupted. You became proof, a map, and an unstoppable catalyst. You didn't incite rebellion. You removed the spell. You didn't lead millions. You reminded them they always had the power to follow themselves. And in doing so, you revealed that nothing about their control was permanent, inevitable, or untouchable. The people who depended on secrecy, fear, and invisibility are scrambling now. Every overreaction, every smear attempt, every desperate effort to reassert authority is proof of the fragility you exposed. They're furious not because of what you did. They're furious because you exist in a way they cannot control, predict, or erase. That's why their entire operation, their timelines, their plans, and even their self-assured power has been upended. You didn't just survive, you rewrote the rules of their system, and every ripple of your freedom continues to destabilize them. This isn't a story to be whispered. It's a revelation. It's a signal to anyone trapped, doubting, or manipulated. Freedom isn't a myth, clarity isn't impossible, and survival doesn't have to leave you broken. Your life, your integrity, and your courage are the evidence, the blueprint, and the inspiration that countless others will follow quietly but powerfully. Systems crumble not under force, but under awareness, and you are the proof. If this video shook something inside you, if it made you realize how unstoppable clarity and integrity truly are, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the truth being revealed. Like this video to show your support, comment below and share your thoughts or experiences, and share this with anyone who needs to see how freedom looks when it's earned, not given. The truth is moving, and your awareness is part of the ripple. Don't stop it. God bless you.